All right. Well, hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for our event, Establishing AI Risk Thresholds and Red Lines, a Critical Global Policy Priority. I'll go ahead and get us started since we have so much to cover today. My name is Jessica Newman, and I'm the director of the AI Security Initiative, which is part of the UC Berkeley Center for Long-Term Cybersecurity, or CLTC, and we are within the Berkeley School of Information. We're an interdisciplinary research hub advancing AI risk management in the public interest, and we're thrilled to be hosting this event today. This event is part of the inaugural UC Berkeley Tech Policy Week, which is showcasing the breadth and depth of tech policy efforts across the UC Berkeley campus. And so there are a lot of really great events taking place throughout the week, so we encourage everyone to check that out. This event is also an official pre-summit event for the India AI Impact Summit, which will be held in New Delhi in February 2026. The AI Impact Summit will be a pivotal global gathering aimed at shaping a future-oriented agenda for inclusive, responsible, and impactful AI cooperation. And insights from this event today will be shared with the government delegations that are gathering at the summit. I'm thrilled to now introduce our incredible lineup of speakers. In just a moment, I will hand it over to my brilliant colleague, Deepika Raman, who will provide some brief remarks on the context and background of AI risk thresholds and red lines, informed by her extensive research in the space. So that will help set the stage for our discussion today. We'll then start our panel discussion and be joined by Sarah Myers-West, who is the co-executive director of the AI Now Institute. Sarah brings a depth of expertise to policymaking in her current role, with a focus on addressing the market incentives and infrastructures that shape tech's role in society at large, ensuring it serves the interests of the public. We will also be joined by Mark Rottenberg, the executive director and founder of the Center for AI and Digital Policy. He's a leading expert in data protection, open government, and AI policy, having served on many international advisory panels, including the OECD AI Group of Experts. Next, we have Nikki Iliadis, the Director of Global AI Governance at the Future Society. Nikki leads public engagement efforts with global intergovernmental organizations and oversees the organization's International Coordination Forum, the Athens Roundtable on AI and the Rule of Law. We're also joined by Leonie Kessler, who is a policy officer at the European AI Office, working on frontier AI regulation and risk management. Leonie previously worked as a researcher at the Center for the Governance of AI, focusing on risk management and risk thresholds in particular. And lastly, we're also thrilled to have Nada Madkar joining us. Nada is a non-resident research fellow with the AI Security Initiative, leading research efforts on AI risk management and AI risk thresholds. Nada also serves as an executive board member at the Open Ethics Initiative and is an active member of the NIST AI Consortium and ISO standards working groups. So thank you so much to all of our speakers for joining us today. And for everyone tuning in, we will hopefully have a bit of time at the end to take some audience questions. So please put your questions in the Q&A at any point throughout our conversation, and please upvote the questions that you like best. We'll try to get to as many as we can, and we also encourage folks to reach out to us and the speakers after the event today to keep the discussion going. All right, I will now pass it over to Deepika, who will set the stage for us on what exactly thresholds and red lines are and how they came to be so critical to AI governance debates taking place today. Thanks, Deepika.
Thank you, Jess. Hi, everyone. My name is Deepika. I work with Jess at the AI Security Initiative. I mainly lead the AI Thresholds project along with Crystal. Before this, I used to work with the Ministry of Electronics and IT at the Government of India, who are also in charge of hosting us all at the upcoming India AI Impact Summit. Very quickly, all of this started really at the AI Seoul Summit, where 27 countries, along with the EU, came together to sign the ministerial statement, which requires the government's mandate that industries start proving safety in their models before release. This statement was also signed by 16 frontier AI developers, and has come to be known as the Frontier AI Safety Commitments. Both these statements sort of indicated that these companies will will publish their AI safety commitments ahead of the Paris Summit that happened in 2025. 12 of the 16 companies that signed this commitment have published their frameworks. They diverge in many different ways in terms of the types of thresholds that they've picked, in terms of the ways they estimate risk or the risks in scope themselves. but ultimately they've given us an early insight into what internal risk management practices look like at these places. Apart from industry and government, independent research and academic organizations, along with CLTC, have also engaged in work to supplement, to complement state and regulatory efforts, and also inform and support industry efforts to bridge this technical governance gap. When it comes to thresholds and red lines, there is no one unifying definition that we all agree on. Thresholds can be defined using model capabilities, estimates of risk, the safeguards implemented, the deployment context, etc. But ultimately, they need to be empirically grounded and make it possible to assess whether a threshold has been reached. Red line, similarly, the OECD defines it as thresholds defined by unacceptable model capabilities, regardless of mitigations. The World Economic Forum defines it as specific boundaries that AI systems must not cross. But ultimately, they can be defined either using AI behaviors, which is, for instance, that models do not self-replicate without human oversight, or AI uses, for instance, that we prohibit the use of AI to manipulate or surveil children. Why we have designed this discussion right now is mainly that because of the infamous AI arms race, all tech companies are investing billions and fighting to claim that they have the title of the world's most advanced AI to keep investors happy. But because of this, model capabilities are being pushed to the frontier, and some model releases, example, the Claude 4 Opus or the Gemini 2.5 Pro, etc., have already triggered early safeguards and early thresholds in these industry frameworks. But because these are defined in qualitative ways, they have been interpreted differently with every model release. Also, we're seeing companies drop certain risk categories altogether from their frameworks. OpenAI, for instance, dropped persuasion and manipulation, and this coming at a time when experts have repeatedly pointed to how persuasive capabilities of models are at an all-time high. These kind of demonstrate how unilateral these decisions are, and why there's need for further advocacy and research around these governance mechanisms. We at CLTC began this work to supplement the frontier AI safety commitments ahead of the Paris Summit. We published our first white paper on this in February. We've also since engaged in a lot of advocacy around the subject, emphasizing that saying no is both a safety imperative and a governance strategy, and not really a rejection of AI innovation. Ultimately, seeing thresholds as a control mechanism to ensure responsible development. Apart from us, the future society has also been engaged in similar efforts to popularize AI deadlines, to determine when AI development or deployment should be off limits. We highly recommend reading the 3-part series they have on AI red lines. Most recently, they've also led the efforts for the global coalition, calling for the launch of AI red lines before 2026. Over 200 prominent politicians, scientists, Nobel Prize winners have signed this campaign. Nobel Prize laureate Maria Ressa also announced this in her opening speech at the 80th UNGA Assembly, where she, implored that governments come together to prevent universally unacceptable risks and define what AI should never be allowed to do. Ultimately, we see thresholds and AI deadlines as two governance tools that are being most critical in helping us take a proactive approach to AI risk management. And I will now pass it on to Jess to lead us into this discussion.
Thank you so much for the overview, Deepika. So yeah, we'll turn to our panel discussion now. And my first question is for Sarah. So Sarah, you've written about the significant limitations of industry AI risk thresholds as we've seen so far. Can you tell us about what you found in your research and why you think the status quo is insufficient to meaningfully keep AI systems safe?
Yeah, thank you very much for having me today. I think that the thing I'd want to say first and foremost is that the goal that we should be operationalizing for isn't to make AI systems safe, because some of the systems that we're talking about here are inherently unsafe. If we're talking about For example, ISTAR uses of AI, those are systems that are designed for surveillance and targeting, as part of a kill chain. So the goal isn't to make the system safe, it's to make people safe at the end of the day. And this distinction is really important because the frame isn't focused solely on the technology, but it puts the onus on the institutions that are developing and deploying it. So red lines are designed to constrain the behavior of developers, and it's important to make clear what mechanisms create sufficient leverage to do so, especially in a context where there's such significant economic power, capitalization of these firms. In some cases, that does get instrumentalized at a technical level. But equally, we're talking about institutional practices, about regulatory processes, about building sufficient friction that occurs in and between the actors that are engaged in developing and deploying AI. So in the work that was really led by my colleague Heidi Kloff, who's AI Now's chief AI scientist, she and I looked at the long-standing safety and risk thresholds that have been established for critical and defense systems and put them in historical context. And the reason that we wanted to look at that broader history around where these safety and risk thresholds come from is because in the present moment, there is a very robust dialogue around an AI arms race that has fueled an acceleration and a push towards, scaling the military use of AI in ways that are leading to the dilution of these safety and security thresholds. And ironically, and this is the main thrust of the paper, this may ultimately disadvantage the national security goals that these technologies are ostensibly being deployed to uphold. So what we're seeing is a weakening of methodological approaches, an over-reliance on very generalized benchmarks rather than looking very specifically at specific use cases and deployments, a propensity for privatization and outsourcing of technologies, trying to procure AI models off the shelf rather than building them safe by design, and a tendency for companies that are selling products to national security and defense agencies being asked to then grade their own homework, which is a conflict of interest. This is especially important in the context of large language models, where many of these tools have demonstrable failure modes that render them fundamentally inappropriate for use in warfighting. And this could have deadly and geopolitically very consequential impacts. So if we thought about what do we need instead, if we were to take lessons from the period in which many of the existing risk thresholds were developed, it was during the Cold War in a context where the prospect of nuclear war was very real and possible. And in the development of those thresholds, there was scope for a broader public dialogue about the risks and benefits of these tools, the trade-offs that are involved, and that sort of democratic deliberation was then integrated into a much more instrumentalized set of safety goals and thresholds against which technological systems were assessed. And right now we're sort of like racing to those thresholds without having that, risk benefit dialogue that, takes into consideration the needs of a broader public. We would also be having a much more robust conversation that grapples in a real way with the incentive structures that shape the behavior of the firms that are developing and selling these tools. But that's a tenor of discussion that's largely been absent from current AI governing efforts.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much, Sarah. It's so useful and important to ground the conversation in this way from the get-go. And yeah, bringing in the history of thinking about safety and risk thresholds and the point that this is, it's not just about the technical systems. This is about how do we keep people safe. And this is so much more complex, and it has to consider the deep integration of the economic and political forces at play here. So thank you for setting that stage so well for us. I'd like to turn to Leonie next to comment on this from the government side. So In your work, Leonie, in the European AI Office, you are currently helping enforce the risk tiers that are required under the Safety and Security chapter of the General Purpose AI Code of Practice. So can you tell us about the requirements that are in the Code of Practice and the role of the AI Office in that regard?
Yes, sure. Thank you for having me. I actually have some slides I'm going to share me. Okay, yeah, great. So yeah, I'm quickly going to introduce the General Purpose AI Code of Practice. So this code was published last year. Sorry, in like it was developed last year and then published in July, right before the rules for general purpose AI model providers came into application this August. And it was drafted in a large multi-stakeholder process and written by a number of independent experts. And today I will talk mainly or focus on the safety and security chapter of this code, which includes systemic risk tiers, as the chapter calls them. This chapter only applies to providers of general purpose AI models with systemic risk, which are the most powerful models that might pose these large scale risks like cyber risks or loss of control risks. So in the code, providers are required to integrate risk tiers in their so-called safety and security frameworks. So these are risk management frameworks that have various names in industry. And essentially, the code considers these risk tiers part of if-then commitments. So essentially, if a certain risk tier is met, then mitigations XYZ that are supposed to be predefined on a high level are supposed to be implemented. And this needs to be laid out in this safety framework that needs to be sent to the AI office. And then the code also foresees a few design criteria for these systemic risk tiers. So first of all, they need to be capabilities-based. They also need to be measurable, and they need to include at least one risk tier per systemic risk, which the model has not yet reached. They also have a rather open-ended criterion that says the risk tiers need to be appropriate, and appropriate is defined in the glossary of the code in the way you can see here on the screen. And in general, these risk tiers need to contribute to ensuring that the systemic risks from every model is kept at acceptable levels. The role of the risk tiers in the code of practice goes beyond the framework. So the framework is essentially this like risk management plan that the companies publish ahead of time. But then they also need to apply these risk tiers when they make go, no-go decisions about whether to proceed with model development or deployment. So essentially, risk tiers under the code of practice come in here when they answer the question, can we go ahead? Are individual and overall systemic risk acceptable? And one of the key factors here are the systemic risk tiers, which under the code are one type of systemic risk acceptance criteria. There are also, of course, mitigations that need to be taken into account. So if we have reached a risk tier, so a certain level of capability, have we put in place sufficient mitigations to keep risk to acceptable levels? And there can also be other considerations. And then this all gives quite some leeway to companies to define their own risk tiers. And so the question is what's the role of the AI office and the European AI office in all of this? So the AI office will come in and eventually supervise and enforce and verify that the companies actually meet the explicit criteria in the code, but also just in general that their combination of risk tiers and mitigations keeps risk to acceptable level. And the AI office can even in the future, if it wants, it can release guidance on what it expects from companies here. I will leave it with that for now.
Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you so much, Leonie. It's really helpful to hear about the code of practice and see, the specific criteria for determining those systemic risk thresholds. this is, one of the first documents to guide company behavior on this issue that's actually backed up with regulation with the EU AI Act. So really helpful to hear that perspective. Thank you. Let me turn it to Nikki next, if I can, to bring in your important work on determining intolerable risk thresholds, or those AI red lines. So you are leading the global call for AI red lines and encouraging governments and other stakeholders to determine those unacceptable risk thresholds or red lines for AI development and use. So can you tell us, why is this important? How does this build on what we've been hearing from the other panelists so far? What's next for the coalition? How does this, build on the prohibitions in the EU AI Act and other developments in the field?
Great. Well, first, let me say thank you, Jessica. It's really great to be here. I'm very excited. So I think you asked a couple of questions, so let me try to tackle them all. The first one, why are we pushing for international red lines for AI? And I guess more generally, why does this even matter? Well, let me start by simply saying AI is a high-risk technology, and just like other high-risk technologies, just like biotech or nuclear or aviation, it needs limits. Well, to Sarah's point, it's probably more accurate to not say that AI needs limits, but the designers developing these systems and the AI providers actually, deploying them are the ones that need limits. So this, on its own, hopefully is not too radical of a statement, although these days it seems some people try to paint it out that way. But the truth is that we're no longer dealing with the harmless development or the harmless developments and applications of AI systems. We've seen several incidents unfold in just the previous years. There have been deepfakes that have really targeted elections in several countries. There were cases in Argentina, in India, in Slovakia, in several countries in Africa. There are now, unfortunately, multiple documented harmful interactions between vulnerable groups in society, including children, and large language models. There was, I remember, an AI voice cloning scam that stole 25 million from a firm and from an engineering firm in Hong Kong. And actually, my own grandmother's sister, who lives in a small village in Greece, very remote part of the world, was targeted by an AI scam that stole a large portion of her savings. So this isn't meant to be, I guess what I'm trying to say through all these examples is that this isn't meant to be theoretical. It's not meant to be alarmist. It's already affecting our democracies, our security, our economies, our elders, our children. So I guess if we don't set red lines for AI, this harm is only expected to escalate. And this is going to happen if systems grow in capabilities and if systems get more embedded in our society. So that's the main reason behind the global call for AI red lines. That's why a coalition of civil society organizations like the Center for Long-Term Cybersecurity, like the Center for AI and Digital Policy, which we'll hear Mark from speak on, and many others came together to basically ask for governments to come together and come up with international agreement to really define and enforce these red lines. So Deepika mentioned this earlier. We announced it at the UN General Assembly, and momentum has been going pretty strong. The call has now been endorsed by over 90 organizations, and there's more than 1,500 individuals involved. That includes former heads of states and ministers and 15 Nobel laureates, which is pretty impressive. I think, importantly, to me at least, the support extends far beyond the typical AI policy communities. Signatories include leaders from human rights and from media integrity and from economics and child safety. And I think that's really important to show that this really has become a global challenge. It's not just in a siloed circle this conversation is being held. So yeah, just to jump, I guess, to your second question, what do we actually mean by red lines? They're meant to be enforceable thresholds for risks that society deems to be unacceptable. And really, the EUA Act has done phenomenal work towards this end. But what we want here is to go further. We want to go international, right? So there are two main aspects. The first one is to build international consensus on what we mean by unacceptable risks. And to what I was saying, there's the EU AI Act. The EU AI Act bans specific applications, for example. It bans social scoring. There are certain types of biometric surveillance that are also banned. The General Purpose Code of Practice has specific guidelines for unacceptable risks as well. There's also, beyond the EU AI Act, there's the Council of Europe AI Convention that includes specific prohibitions related to human rights. There's the UNESCO recommendation on AI ethics that also includes its own set of they don't call them red lines, but its own set of bans. There's national and even in the US state level regulation that's now being initiated that has specific prohibitions. And there's even AI companies that have released their own voluntary safety frameworks and responsible scaling policies. But, I think Sarah said this earlier also as well, that that's not enough. These are fragmented and they're inconsistent. They're in most cases voluntary. So what we're missing really is an international baseline with enforcement. So yeah, that's the goal of our campaign. The goal of the Red Lines is to connect and strengthen these efforts across borders. I guess you also asked what's the next steps for the Red Lines Coalition. I think about it in three pillars. The first one is we're expanding our global coalition at local, national, and international levels. So we think there's already a lot of people pushing for red lines. We want to build further consensus between these groups, but at least coordination, making sure the different civil society organizations are learning from each other, understanding what their work is, and figuring out how to how to help each other, I guess push for these concrete red lines. And there's a few forums coming up, including the India's Impact Summit, that are going to be key milestones in terms of conversation for our global community to move forward this red line. So we want to make sure that red lines remains in the agenda of these forums. The second one is we're thinking through the actual pathways and like diplomatic pathways towards international agreement. So we're helping facilitate track 2 dialogues between diplomats and also the technologists and the policymakers and the scientists in order to explore what are the actual political instruments for agreement and then enforcement. And I think there's a lot of learnings that we can take from even spaces outside of AI for how this has worked for other global challenges, as I was saying earlier, related maybe to chemical or nuclear or so on. And the third area would be going further down, I guess, rather than wide. So doing a bit more granular research. I know there's a lot of research institutes. There's a lot of other organizations that are doing deep dives into specific red lines. TFS itself, I don't think is taking a position. We don't want to be prospective on these are the specific red lines that should be going forward, but we want to look at examples of what red lines are coming from. So we're helping, we're collaborating, I guess, with others to do that research around to give you some examples, maybe prohibitions related to biological weapons or banning harmful interactions related to children and so on. So just to close up, I just want to make the case that red line is not red lines are not supposed to be about panic. They're more about prevention, and they're definitely not about slowing down innovation. I think that talking point has been, heard over and over by industry lobbyists for years, and I really hope in the coming year we hear less about that. So yeah, to me, red lines are about protecting society. It's about innovation being possible, right? The alternative would be to wait for more harm, for more large scale harm to actually manifest, and that's not responsible, I think, for us as humans to allow. So, and I just want to say that the world has done it before. The world has drawn red lines before. We've seen it for biological weapons. We've seen it for chemical attacks. We restricted nuclear testing, and even multilateralism now being at strain. We saw it a few months ago. There was a high seas treaty that recently came out. So I think the call is to get the international community to do it again for AI, and the window is narrowing, but we believe, I guess, that this is an opportunity actually for governments to come together to find that lowest common denominator of what isn't working, and then to understand that some risks from AI are just too great to take, and that we need some lines that must never be crossed. So I'll pause there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nikki. And I love that line of, this is not about panic, this is about prevention. I think that's such an important point. And thank you for leading this coalition. CLTC is proud to be one of the partner organizations in the coalition, and it's just really important work. So thanks for everything you're doing there. I'd love to turn it to you, Mark, next. I'm hoping you can connect some dots for us. So you've written about how the broader AI governance ecosystem calls for red lines of varying kinds. And so can you talk about the role of, for example, the Council of Europe AI Treaty, the Hiroshima AI process, the UN AI resolution in helping to shape that broader ecosystem of articulation of AI red lines and thresholds?
Thank you, Jessica, and thank you, Berkeley, for organizing this great panel. I also want to acknowledge the excellent work that Nikki and the Future Society have done on this issue. You mentioned at the beginning that I had worked on the OECD AI principles, which was the first global framework for AI governance. And I was very proud of the principles. And at the same time, I felt there was a lot that I guess we would say had been left on the cutting room floor. A lot of principles and objectives that I really wanted to see incorporated in the OECD AI principles that were not. And I separately gathered that material together and went to many leading AI scientists and human rights organizations and ACM and IEEE and gathered support for a document that we actually issued before the OECD work was completed, called the Universal Guidelines for AI. And you'll see in a moment the relevance of this particular document. If you look down at the bottom, we have the termination obligation. But you see in the termination obligation, I think one of the cornerstones of the effort to establish red lines for AI systems. And I think this was well articulated in the sense that when we consider the range of reasons to prohibit or limit the use of AI, there are many, many different categories, and I'll talk about them in a moment. But at its core, the aim is to ensure human control of the AI system. And if it's not possible to maintain human control of the AI system, then I think we also have to state clearly that the organization that established the system has an affirmative obligation to terminate the system. And this is essentially coupling, the act of creation with a responsible oversight and management that is also essential to how we think about AI governance. So that was an important starting point for how we think about red lines in AI systems. Since that time, I've written quite a bit about this. This was an article I did recently with my colleague, Christabel Randolph. She's the associate director here at CADIP. And as we worked in these various government proceedings, with OECD, with the European Union, with the Council of Europe, with UNESCO and others, it did occur to us that one of the biggest challenges for AI policymakers was, first of all, actually committing to prohibit a class of AI systems and then implementing and enforcing that obligation. Most AI policymakers have an instinct that says, well, if there's a problem, let's see if we can fix the problem. Let's improve transparency. Let's improve data provenance. Let's, identify the challenge and we'll try to solve it. But actually saying that we need to draw some clear lines and we can't pass over those red lines, I think is conceptually one of the biggest goals in this field. Now, I am still jumping around a little bit here, going to try to share with you when I endorsed the Red Line campaign that the Future Society launched. What I did was to try to put in context the evolution of the prohibitions that had been established since the Universal Guidelines for AI included the termination obligation. So here you see the termination obligation in 2018, but a lot actually followed, and this is also in the Future Society report. I was impressed, for example, when the human rights chief at the United Nations, the former president of Chile, Michelle Bachelet, said that we had to simply prohibit AI systems that failed to comply with international human rights norms. It seemed intuitive and obvious, yet very few people had actually talked about it or said it. And in a recent letter that CADIP sent to the current head of the Human Rights Commission, Volker Turk, we simply asked him to endorse the earlier position that Bachelet had set out, because that seemed to us an obvious red line. The UNESCO recommendation on AI ethics, which was endorsed by 193 countries, actually set out two prohibitions on the use of AI systems. One was for social scoring. We associate this with China, but it exists in other countries as well. That's essentially when a government makes a rating, an assessment of a person's alignment with the aims of the government, which is obviously very problematic, as well as mass surveillance. That was also in the UNESCO recommendation. You mentioned the Hiroshima AI process, and here's a bit of text from that document. There is, of course, concerns about, democratic society, but also terrorism, criminal misuse. And as you read these statements, and I made an effort to set out clearly what the institutions wrote, again, I'm just struck by what seems to me the inherent obviousness of these conclusions. There's nothing particularly controversial here in saying that you should prohibit an AI system that's particularly harmful to individuals and communities. European Union, of course, in the AI Act, as Leonie described, has 8 categories of AI systems were actually to be prohibited. We're actually doing some work now with the American Law Institute specifically on biometrics. And what is fascinating, of course, about the AI Act is it carries forward regulation of biometrics that aren't simply user identification, but are broadly used for, let's say, subliminal manipulation, which is sentiment analysis and other characteristics that don't necessarily require identification. We did work with the Council of Europe and included some language there. So I think this is a very important campaign. I think it's a very timely campaign. And I'm also, happy to see all this progress from the early days. But I would not underestimate the amount of work ahead. It is very difficult to build broad political consensus, particularly for strong statements that will require implementation. And also, these discussions are taking place in the context of multiple international organizations and governance forums. You may get a red line in one setting that looks very different from a red line in another setting, but that's okay. A consumer protection agency might say, don't deploy an AI system that's not safe for consumers to use. I think they should say that. But in another setting, you might have an international treaty among defense agencies that say we don't want autonomous weapon systems because we're concerned about the loss of human control. And that becomes another type of red line. So I would, say to folks who are working in support of this campaign, keep in mind the various ways in which red lines can be adopted. We don't need, a harmonized approach. What we do need is an effective and meaningful approach.
Those are such great points, Mark. Thank you so much. And yeah, really valuable context on and just an important reminder on how we can build on all of these important existing efforts. Thank you for laying that out. Let me turn to Nada now to bring in some perspective about what we actually know about the landscape of AI risks right now. So some leading AI companies have shared that their newest model releases are beginning to pass internal alert thresholds or dangerous capability thresholds. We heard a little bit about that from Deepika. So can you tell us a little bit, what they're finding, what information they're actually making available about how they're evaluating for those risks, and what more can companies do to promote transparency about the risks they're seeing or how they're determining those risk thresholds?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Jess. As I mentioned earlier in the presentation today, models are reaching or passing their internal thresholds. The examples of Gemini 2.5 Pro with cyber uplift triggering early warning signs, and Claude Opus 4 being deployed with ASL3 standards due to significantly improved CBRN capabilities. And they stated in the model card that while they haven't yet determined whether the model has definitively passed the thresholds, they can't clearly rule it out either. I think there's a lack of clarity when it comes to reporting. And as these models continue to grow in capabilities, we should really aim for improvements in transparency and reporting. Some of these improvements related to the safety frameworks, I think it would be a lot better if they could provide explanation and justification for how and why these thresholds are being chosen by sharing the methods and the reasoning behind those decisions. Right now, it's completely unclear how they even came to these conclusions. providing justification for major changes in the safety frameworks. For example, when OpenAI removed mass manipulation and disinformation as a major risk in their preparedness framework, adequate justification wasn't provided. They can also provide more than 1 or 2 risk levels leading up to their intolerable or final threshold, and working towards having more quantitative measurable thresholds. For example, Anthropic does highlight 2 of the highest levels for CBRN, AI R&D, and only 1 for cyber, while OpenAI highlights high and critical thresholds for CBRN, cyber, and self-improvement. But I think it would be a lot better to have more risk levels beneath that so that we can better prepare for when we're reaching those more critical levels. Also clarifying criteria for determining whether or not the model is unfit for deployment. Many of those safety frameworks, they do present the risk levels, but it's more for the purpose of selecting the level of safeguards or the extent of safeguards, but it's not clear what level of risk they would determine would make a model not deployable to begin with. And I think working towards unifying and standardizing these safety frameworks to some level would help promote transferability and comparison, because as it is right now, it's really difficult to compare between 2 different safety frameworks or 2 different thresholds or similar thresholds in safety frameworks. As for the system and model cards, particularly the evaluation results, they could also use some clarification and enhancement. So while the scores are often provided for certain evaluations, it's not really clear at all how these scores are being translated to risk levels or how they even correlate with them. It would be really useful to understand how close or far the model is from reaching the next risk level, or how far it is from surpassing the risk level that it is in right now. For example, the Claude 4 system card does include a threshold for multimodal virology set at the average score achieved by expert baseliners, which is at 22.1%. And they had similar other quantitative indicators in their capabilities, which was really helpful for trying to understand how far it is from actually reaching the thresholds that they've set. Another improvement would be providing scores for both pre and post mitigation, which is sometimes included, but not always. And I think that's where something like a standardization would come in handy. But it would be very important to understand these risk levels if the safeguards are circumvented or fail, which often happens. And research that's done after the model deployment, not for the purpose of the model card, it's not usually included in an addendum, for example. So I think as researchers continue to discover things about risks, I think these model cards should be updated so that they can document these risks and they can be reflected, particularly in regards to reaching these thresholds. That being said, I do think that more work needs to be done around identifying, balancing between meaningful transparency and dangerous transparency. The goal for model developers is to provide information that's meaningful for external stakeholders and not necessarily information that can be used by malicious actors for misuse. So I think there's a little bit of work that needs to be done there. And we also need to think about how to incentivize labs for releasing information on risks, considering the pushback that some of them get for publishing research on these specific risks. I think there's definitely a lot more grounds to cover here in terms of transparency and reporting and making sure that these thresholds are understandable and transferable. But these are kind of the top of mind things for now. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Nada. Yeah, I mean, it's such a critical piece of the puzzle to make sure policymakers, the broader public, actually have some reliable information about what harms and hazards we're seeing, both in evaluations and out in the real world. So yeah, thank you so much for that. Let me pose a question to the full group to build on this a little bit. So we've heard a lot about the challenges with the current processes of determining and adhering to risk thresholds. What are some things that we could do to improve these processes and practices? And specifically, is there anything we can do to improve the incentives for AI companies to develop and adhere to robust AI risk thresholds?
I'm happy to jump in here. So, I mean, I think I said at the start that really looking at those incentive structures is really important. And just to put a finer point on it, I think moving past a status quo where we're kind of stuck relying on voluntary compliance with guidelines that don't have teeth. It's important to, one, enforce existing regulatory frameworks, require adherence to existing risk thresholds in procurement processes, and then institutionally develop the kinds of leverage and friction that meaningfully change corporate behavior. I think one of the challenges from the broadest standpoint in the AI sector is that we've largely been stuck in an ex post approach to how to regulate or seek accountability from these companies. We're trying to fix harms after the fact, many of which don't actually have meaningful redress. Like you're dealing with, in healthcare context, if there's been a mistake in an AI system, the effect on a patient's health outcome can be long past by the time that you're seeking remediation. And so I think putting the onus back on companies to demonstrate and validate that they're compliant with existing law, that they're meaningfully and robustly validating and testing their systems, and then continuing that friction throughout the life cycle of deployment is the best path forward. That also means having sufficient penalties that are going to change the behavior of again, some of the biggest companies in the world.
Yeah. Well, maybe we can go to Leonie next because you're helping to set up that infrastructure.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I fully agree with what Sarah said. I think, just pointing again to the general purpose AI code of practice, I think it's a really important step in this direction of both harmonizing best practices and standards, but also being a tool for the first regulator in the world to properly enforce a few of these things. And also to address the question that has already come up in the audience, yes, the AI office has enforcement capacities and powers to request information, model access, mitigation measures, recalling models, and impose fines eventually. These only start to apply for the GPI models in a year from now, but we do have them. And then the other thing I want to mention is that, of course, we also closely follow regulations in other parts of the world. So SB 53 is a great example that also is very important, I think, in terms of public transparency to enable the broader public to take part in these discussions.
Thanks so much. Nikki and Mark, you want us to jump in here too?
Yeah, I'll keep it short. Just two thoughts came to my mind that I want to highlight. The first one, the importance of building an independent evaluation and oversight capacity. We can't just rely on the companies themselves to have their responsible scaling policies. We as a community, right, need to be working on that. And I think those metrics need to be interpretable across borders again in order to make sure that they're effective. Then the second point, I think incentive alignment is very complex and very hard, but I also want to highlight here that it can go in different directions. Some of it can be top down, so the governments can do a lot to first make sure that there are certain risk thresholds that, as a condition for market access or through export controls or through procurement guidelines, help set those incentives. But I also want to say that there is a role, and this is an empowering message, hopefully, for just the common citizen to demand more, I think, from companies and to make sure that the systems are being developed and deployed in a safe manner, right? And I think if I could make a prediction, as we see more incidents unfolding and the harm being put in society, I'm seeing some of that happen, but I think we can do much more.
Thanks so much.
Well, I just wanted to agree with what others said and actually take it a step further. I'm a very big believer as we think about AI governance in the creation of independent supervisory authorities and the structures of oversight, which is actually a key part of the EU AI Act. And I know Leonie is doing a lot of work with the various supervisory authorities of the member states. The problem oftentimes when we're talking about AI governance or responsible AI, people get very focused on principles and guidelines, and then they say appropriately, we don't want self-regulation, we want real enforcement, and we want remedies. And all of that is true. But my advice is keep going. In other words, when you think about independent agencies, you want agencies that have the ability to investigate and to subpoena and obtain data and examine models and assess compliance. And again, nothing that I'm saying is particularly radical, because if you look at any other sector of our modern economy, whether it's transportation or pharmaceuticals or even financial instruments, oversight agencies routinely have these powers for the obvious reason that if they didn't, they could not effectively discharge their responsibilities. So I think we really need to press much further in this direction. Not say it would be nice just to have an agency to review these reports, but actually ensure that agencies have those investigative powers to determine what companies are actually doing. And I'll just, throw out an example because, of course, I spent a lot of time over the years working on privacy issues and going to the FTC and trying to get them to take action against Facebook and Google and others. And they were very resistant. But when they actually did an investigation and pursued some of the allegations that we had made, what they uncovered supported what we had alleged. It just took a lot of time to get them to take action. Just one famous story, I don't know if you all remember, Google is still sending cars around neighborhoods capturing images for Street View, right? And we were aware of this, over a decade ago, that those Google cars were also intercepting and downloading Wi-Fi communications in the neighborhoods that they were going through. So you had the surface level privacy issue of the camera observing and recording images in a neighborhood for Street View. But then you had this deeper privacy issue, which we had reason to believe was occurring, and Google was denying. Well, it actually took a privacy commissioner in Germany to seize one of the vehicles, open the hard drive, and find all the Wi-Fi communications that had been recorded and stored, not just by that vehicle, but by every vehicle that was part of the Google Street View network. So I'm sharing that concrete example because I think we all need to begin to think about how do we create the kinds of agencies that have those investigative authorities to uncover and assess actual business practice.
Yeah. Yeah, that's so important. We got a few questions coming in about determining specific red lines and the process of doing that. So I want to turn to that for a moment. There have been some specific red lines already proposed and gained traction. Mark talked through some of those. Nikki talked through some. Just this morning, there was actually a statement released that was signed by hundreds of public figures, including Prince Harry and Steve Wozniak and many others, calling for a prohibition on the development of superintelligence until there is actually public support for superintelligence and scientific consensus it could be done safely. There's many other examples, including prohibiting the delegation of nuclear launch authority to AI systems, which the US and China has agreed to. And we heard about UNESCO member states agreeing to prohibit mass surveillance and social scoring as well. So, how do we think about supporting more democratic deliberation and determining where, what are those red lines that we need to see? And one of the questions in the chat was about, is there a way to so both supporting who is part of that process of determining those, and also is there any way to have more of a quantifiable thresholds or red lines to help really be able to track how close we are to it? Nikki, I'll call on you if I can, given your work here.
No, please do. Well, I don't have a good answer though. I guess that's my disclaimer to start. But I do think this is important. We need how I think about it in my head, right? We need a formal process in order to have international dialogue to deem what is unacceptable and what is not. We can't rely right now on tech companies to tell us like this is too risky or this is not enough. What that will look like. I think the main challenge that we have to confront is AI for many people, for a lot of people in the general public at least, is still an abstract theoretical concept. And when we talk a lot about of these risks, it's something that maybe a lot of people yet cannot yet engage with. I think that's changing and it's also generational, but that seems to be the case, at least in my different experiences. So I think there's definitely um, probably different levels of engagement of different stakeholder groups that are going to be important. How we think about it is it seems to be a coalition of different states and also different organizations that are really leading efforts to come up with specific red lines to what you were saying. There was, I think now over a year ago, the initiative called the International Dialogue on AI Safety that brought together scientists from the East and West, and they came up with 5 specific red lines. And I think that's a good baseline to also work. We also throughout this meeting have referred to a bunch of other ones. I think the point right now is again to bring in diplomats to these conversations to actually think through, okay, what is the pathway of actually thinking through concrete enough definitions for these in order to build agreements on them and then actual oversight and enforcement mechanisms afterwards. So I didn't, this was very political of me. I didn't completely answer your question, but just some thoughts, I guess, too.
No,
That's
that's perfect. Thank you. Nada.
So I think maybe this is not exactly red lines, but a place that we can start is similar to the EU AI Act, establish some prohibited use cases where there are certain things that you cannot use it for, and then certain capabilities that shouldn't be existing for those use cases. I think that would be a good place to start. I don't think that all these kind of public models need to have all of these capabilities, especially considering what most people use it for. We really don't need models that are able to build weapons or develop phishing emails when you're trying to just put together, I don't know, a writing sample or something. So maybe just agreeing on prohibited use cases would be a good place to start for that.
Yeah, great point. We have a question here about what advice you would offer to a civil society coalition that has limited resources about raising awareness for AI red lines in a way that could be both comprehensive and effective, that could resonate across borders and cultures, and building on rather than duplicating what already exists. So wanted to ask the panelists here any advice or ideas about how we can really keep that momentum going.
It's a good question, I think, for Nikki, but as a general matter, we always encourage others and groups to amplify the campaigns that are underway, because those campaigns do need more support, and the more outreach and the more endorsement they receive, the more effective they can be. Sometimes groups identify an issue that has not yet been raised and want to build a campaign around a new issue, which is good. But I also think maybe if you can do it in a complementary way so that you're both uplifting related efforts and also calling attention to something that you think requires attention, it does help build a movement. One of the dynamics we're trying to avoid is when people are working across purposes that can, sometimes create a bit of a conflict. But I think it's, great to support current campaigns and to create new complementary efforts.
Yeah, thanks so much. Unfortunately, I'd love to keep this conversation going. And unfortunately, we're already at the end of the hour. I want to encourage everyone who's put these great questions into the chat to feel free to reach out to myself or to the other panelists that you've heard from today. Let me say thank you so much to all of our great speakers. Really appreciate you joining us and sharing your expertise, and we're really deeply grateful for your time as well as for all of the work that you're doing in this field. I want to also say thank you to CLTC and the Berkeley Tech Policy Week, as well as to the team behind the India AI Impact Summit. And thanks to everyone in the audience for joining us. Yeah, please feel free to reach out and keep these important conversations moving forward. So thanks so much, everyone. Take care.